The storm between the United States and China no longer lingers in policy papers or boardroom discussions. It has spilled into the streets, into people's homes, and even into the fragile bonds of communities that once thought themselves far removed from the geopolitical battlefield. What began as a trade dispute has grown into an all-encompassing confrontation that touches every layer of life, from the taxes paid on imported goods, to the smartphones and cameras sitting in living rooms, to the identity cards and residency permits of Chinese immigrants abroad. It is not just a clash of two superpowers. It is a drama that redefines trust, security, and belonging in the 21st century. In recent weeks, Washington announced new tariffs that doubled down on earlier measures, raising duties to 100% on a swath of Chinese products. The headlines seemed dry at first, numbers stacked in columns and charts. But behind them was a clear message: America was willing to absorb consumer pain in order to erect a strategic wall. For years, American companies had relied on Chinese factories for everything from basic electronics to advanced materials. Now they were being forced into a new reality where supply chains must shift, alliances must harden, and dependence would be punished. Tariffs alone were not the only weapon. Federal agencies also moved against technology already embedded in the daily lives of millions of Americans. The order to remove Chinese-made cameras, routers, and smart devices from stores and public infrastructure was a bombshell. Suddenly, the battlefield was no longer the shipping yard or the customs gate, but the living room, the office, the school. The question now hung heavy. Were the tools of everyday convenience secretly tethered to Beijing's surveillance apparatus? Beijing, predictably, refused to remain silent. If America weaponized tariffs and security bans, China brandished its own ace card: rare earth elements. Accounting for 70% of global refined output, China controls materials critical to electric vehicles, wind turbines, fighter jets, and smartphones. The declaration of new export restrictions was not phrased as a complete ban, but the intent was unmistakable. China could strangle the arteries of advanced industries at will, and it wanted the world to know. The markets responded in kind. American equities slid, Chinese A-shares tumbled, and even cryptocurrencies took collateral damage. Investors realized this was no longer a negotiation over trade balances. It was a signal that the very architecture of globalization was cracking, and a new order built on coercion was rising. Yet the most dramatic consequences were not confined to boardrooms or trading floors. They erupted inside communities, carried by handcuffs, immigration raids, and accusations of espionage. In early October, residents of Brooklyn's Chinese enclaves gathered to celebrate the Mid-Autumn Festival. Among them should have been a familiar figure, a woman known for organizing cultural events and galvanizing the diaspora. Instead, photographs began circulating on WeChat. She was being led away by federal agents, wrists cuffed, face pale, eyes clouded with tears. The shock rippled instantly. How could a leader who once brought local politicians and diplomats together now be branded an undocumented immigrant at risk of deportation? For years she had been suspected of cultivating ties with the Chinese consulate, even investigated by the FBI for possible involvement in influence operations. Now her personal immigration troubles, failed marriages, contested green card applications, had converged with the broader suspicion that surrounded her public persona. The descent was brutal, from the spotlight of banquets and ceremonies to the cold cell of an ICE detention facility. As this story spread, another scandal surfaced in Virginia. An organization presenting itself as a non-profit supporting Chinese-American truck drivers was revealed to be running an astonishing scheme. It had enabled thousands of new arrivals, many crossing the southern border illegally, to obtain commercial truck licenses in as little as 3 weeks. Exams conducted in Chinese, boasting a perfect pass rate. Records suggested direct ties to United Front networks and affiliated chambers of commerce controlled from Beijing. Conservative media pounced, portraying it as both a security threat and a symbol of loopholes that compromised American sovereignty. Within days, Texas authorities suspended issuance of commercial licenses to non-citizens, a measure that threatened to revoke thousands of permits and unleash a wave of deportations. What might have once been an obscure local irregularity had suddenly become a matter of national alarm, woven tightly into the narrative of Chinese infiltration. Inside the diaspora itself, divisions deepened. Leaders of long-standing associations, once celebrated for their patriotism, began turning on one another. Some accused Beijing's envoys of corruption and manipulation. Videos circulated of public meetings where insults were hurled at consular officials, branding them puppets, predicting their downfall. In Houston, one community figure who had long been regarded as a staunch supporter of Chinese unification was arrested not by American authorities but by China's own security services on espionage charges, eventually sentenced to life imprisonment. It was a reminder that loyalty to Beijing was never a guarantee of safety. Even the most devoted could be discarded, exposed, or punished if the tides of factional struggle demanded it. The paradox was glaring. To serve China abroad was to risk being cast out by America, but to fall short in Beijing's eyes was to face retribution at home. The human cost of these entanglements cannot be captured in policy memos. For ordinary immigrants, each crackdown is a tightening noose. A camera in their house is suddenly labeled a threat. A trucking license they thought legitimate is now grounds for deportation. A leader they trusted becomes a warning example of what happens when politics consumes community. The shock quickly mutates into anger. American citizens look at highways filled with drivers whose training they now doubt, and they worry about safety. Members of Chinese associations rage at being treated like pawns, their cultural pride conflated with espionage. But beneath the anger lies sorrow. Many discover that their years of effort, their attempt to reconcile pride in their heritage with life in America, has left them stranded between two powers that view them only as instruments. The story loops back inevitably to the larger clash. The trade war and the community scandals are not separate fronts but interconnected expressions of a single struggle. When Washington hikes tariffs and bans technology, it sends a message not just to Beijing, but also to Chinese business owners in New York and California, who now wonder whether their products or affiliations will draw suspicion. When Beijing rattles the rare earth saber, it reassures its domestic audience of strength, but also deepens the stigma faced by its diaspora abroad, who are increasingly seen as potential extensions of state power. Every strategic move on the global stage reverberates in the smallest details of personal life. A tax rate becomes a closed factory. A factory becomes a job lost. A job lost becomes a desperate attempt to cling to status through a community association, and that association becomes a target for federal raids. It is a cycle of escalation where no boundary remains intact. What makes the situation truly perilous is not any single arrest or tariff announcement, but the erosion of trust itself. Trust between nations has collapsed, and now trust between individuals is corroding. Neighbors eye each other's devices with suspicion. Community members whisper about who might be reporting to the consulate or the FBI. Business partners hesitate before signing contracts, uncertain if sanctions or bans will render them worthless. Even within families, fear creeps in. Should one keep ties to hometown associations, or cut them to avoid guilt by association? Should one invest in a Chinese-made electric car, or assume it will be barred from American roads in the near future? These are not abstract dilemmas. They are lived realities in households across the diaspora. The narrative comes full circle when considering the symbolic weight of festivals and rituals. The Mid-Autumn Festival, meant to symbolize reunion and light in darkness, became instead the backdrop for humiliation as a community leader was dragged away. National Day, once celebrated with parades and cultural performances in foreign cities, now carries undertones of division, as some associations split between loyalty to Beijing and fear of legal consequences in the West. What should have been expressions of cultural pride have become entangled with geopolitical agendas, robbing them of innocence and replacing them with suspicion. The festivals continue, the mooncakes are eaten, but the conversations in the shadows tell another story. Who will be next? What affiliation will trigger scrutiny? And how long before the walls close in further? This is not simply about tariffs or immigration cases. It is the dawn of a new era of confrontation where every tool is weaponized. Trade policy becomes a shield and a sword. Technology becomes a battlefield disguised as consumer electronics. Immigration law becomes a mechanism of counter-espionage. Community organizations become contested terrain between loyalty and survival. The consequences ripple outward, destabilizing markets, breaking friendships, and undermining identities. The choice for individuals is stark: maintain transparency and distance from political entanglements, or risk being ground down by the machinery of suspicion that now operates on both sides of the Pacific. The United States and China may continue to exchange threats and gestures, each believing they are protecting their sovereignty. Yet caught in between are the millions who neither drafted the tariffs nor signed the deportation orders, who only wanted stability, community, and a sense of belonging. They now carry the burden of a conflict that turns their devices, their licenses, their festivals, even their faces, into symbols of mistrust. The irony is bitter. For decades, globalization promised connection, prosperity, and shared progress. Today, the very networks that tied economies and cultures together are being severed, and in their place stands a fragile world where loyalty is suspect, heritage is politicized, and every choice feels dangerous. The lesson is brutal but clear. This confrontation is not a temporary storm that will pass with a new trade deal or a change of administration. It is the foundation of a long epoch where lines are drawn deeper and neutrality is increasingly impossible. Nations will demand proof of allegiance, markets will fracture along ideological seams, and individuals will be forced to navigate an existence defined by competing powers. For the diaspora, the price of serving two masters is exposure, vulnerability, and often betrayal. For governments, the temptation to exploit these vulnerabilities may prove irresistible, and for ordinary citizens on both sides, the only certainty is that the age of innocence in U.S.-China relations is over. In the end, it is not the size of tariffs or the number of arrests that defines this era, but the collapse of faith in coexistence. Trust has been replaced by suspicion, integration by decoupling, pride by fear. Those who once believed they could live between two worlds are discovering that the walls are closing and the space in between is vanishing. This is the true cost of the U.S.-China confrontation, not only economic disruption, but the corrosion of community, identity, and hope itself. And as long as both governments see every object, every license, and every leader as a potential weapon, ordinary lives will continue to be caught in a crossfire with no clear end in sight.